The true measure of empire is rarely tallied in the blood spilled across a battlefield. It resides instead in the profound terror cultivated within the hearts of those who mistake their dominion for an unassailable truth. For generations, the English military machine operated under a self-imposed delusion, an invincibility forged not merely by conquest, but by a relentless, secular logic that declared dominance as an immutable law of nature. This was the fragile hegemony established during the Lancastrian occupation, a system where professional infantry, hardened by endless campaigning and the shadow of their own perceived divine right, believed they were impervious to the tide of French resistance. In the early 14th century, England controlled vast swaths of France. This dominion was not founded on simple brute force alone. It was an empire constructed through political maneuvering, strategic land acquisition, and the brutal arithmetic of attrition. The English command structure was a monument to cold, calculating reason. Supply lines, tactical positioning, logistics, the meticulous application of secular logic designed to crush the enemy through sheer material superiority. Their professional soldiers, veterans of countless skirmishes across disparate territories, possessed a morale as ironclad as the plate armor they wore, convinced that superior numbers and ingrained ruthlessness rendered them unstoppable. They projected an aura of inevitability. Their presence was deemed ordained, allowing them to maintain control over millions by instilling a psychological weight derived from the implied threat of swift, overwhelming retaliation. Yet, even the most fortified structures are subject to internal fissures. The maintenance of such vast occupation demanded an astronomical expenditure of resources, and this systemic exhaustion bred a dangerous complacency among the French nobility and military command. Despair began to curdle into defeatism. They started to view the English not as an existential threat demanding immediate annihilation, but as a grinding, inevitable obstacle, a logistical puzzle that could be worn down through time and relentless pressure. This collective defeatist mindset mistook stagnation for strength, allowing the psychological momentum of the occupation to stall. English commanders relied heavily on this carefully constructed aura of inevitability. They understood that their power resided not just in the sharpness of their steel, but in the atmospheric dominance they exerted over a hostile population. They leveraged an image of cosmic destiny, suggesting that their reign was divinely sanctioned, which allowed them to govern through psychological supremacy and the constant threat of merciless retribution. Then, into this rigid structure of secular control, an anomaly entered the equation: Joan of Arc. She did not arrive as a seasoned general or a political envoy negotiating treaties. She materialized as a radical, disruptive variable, bypassing the established military hierarchy entirely. Her authority was not rooted in lineage, papal decree, or battlefield command, but derived from an unshakable, almost irrational conviction that she spoke directly to a higher power. This divine mandate instantly detonated the secular logic upon which English morale had been built. The contrast between the two forces was stark and immediate. The English captains, trained in the cold, rational mathematics of siege warfare and tactical positioning, the calculated assaults that had defined their campaigns, found themselves confronted by an adversary whose threat seemed entirely immaterial, a force guided not by earthly strategy, but by celestial decree. When facing a foe backed by perceived holy wrath, the hard-won certainty of professional military skill dissolved into profound psychological terror. The immediate effect rippled through the French camp culture, where there had been the grim resignation of mercenaries awaiting meager winter rations and promises of paltry reward. There emerged a strange, potent conviction. Soldiers began to perceive their struggle not merely as a territorial dispute over land, but as a cosmic conflict waged on sacred ground. They were transformed from desperate fighters into participants in a grand, sacred destiny, converting paralyzing despair into zealous fervor. This transformation reached its zenith at the crucible of siege warfare. At Orleans, the established tactical doctrines of the English veterans, the methodical, calculated assaults that had defined their campaigns across the Loire Valley, suddenly found themselves rendered obsolete by an immaterial force. Joan's presence did not merely introduce new leadership. She injected a supernatural element into the very dynamic of the conflict, forcing the English to abandon their familiar defensive routines in favor of an entirely different calculus, the reckoning of faith. English commanders desperately sought rational explanations for their sudden tactical failures, the inexplicable momentum of the French advance. In this vacuum of logical control, they resorted to the most potent weapon available: narrative manipulation. The sorcerous narrative became a desperate, flimsy attempt to rationalize their loss of ground and the erosion of morale, a concession that something beyond their secular understanding was at play. But the French exploited this vulnerability with surgical precision. They turned English superstition against them. By emphasizing shared religious destiny, they weaponized the very fear instilled by the English psychological tactics. The psychological weight of the siege began to pivot dramatically. The English were no longer merely occupying forces. They became agents of an illegitimate, profane power encroaching upon sacred French soil. This fundamental shift in perspective was strategically exploited through political theater. The march toward Rheims was never simply a movement of troops across the landscape. It was a calculated psychological campaign designed to delegitimize the very foundation of the English claim to the French throne. By pursuing the sacred rite of coronation, the French forced the English into an impossible paradox. They were compelled to choose between fighting for mere temporal territory or wrestling for divine legitimacy. The ultimate collapse of Lancastrian morale occurred when this ideological warfare finally broke through the defenses of military confidence. Witnessing the miraculous speed and seemingly unstoppable momentum of the French advance through occupied territories dismantled the last vestiges of martial certainty. The focus shifted entirely from tactical defense to existential dread. When the conflict was reframed as a holy war, the immense financial and political commitment required by the English treasury suddenly seemed insurmountable against an opposing will rooted in faith. This ideological fervor acted as a devastating force multiplier. It allowed the French to neutralize superior equipment and entrenched military structures simply by manipulating the psychological narrative. The collapse of established power was not merely a loss of men on the field. It was the complete erasure of an entire philosophical framework that had underpinned their claim to rule. Today, Joan of Arc remains a crucial case study for understanding conflict. Her blueprint for ideological warfare, the ability to harness faith and fear to dismantle entrenched confidence, is a stark reminder that in devastating conflict, the most potent weapon is not always steel, but the meticulously constructed narrative of reality. It demonstrates how psychological influence can completely rewrite the rules of engagement, leaving an indelible mark on history, and still informing the brutal dynamics of modern asymmetric warfare. This dynamic, the harnessing of belief as a strategic instrument, is not an anomaly confined to medieval sieges or religious crusades. It is the essential architecture of all sustained domination. Empires, from the Roman legions to the modern global powers, rely not just on the physical capacity to enforce their will, but on the successful cultivation of an internal consensus that renders resistance unthinkable. The shift in narrative is always the precursor to the collapse of physical reality. Once the people begin to believe what they are told about themselves and their cause, the cost of continued resistance becomes exponentially higher than the cost of compliance. This principle reveals a deeper truth about power. It does not reside solely in the deployment of weapons, but in the mastery of perception. The fear you generate is often more potent than any cannon fire, for it resides within the very consciousness of the governed. And in this continuous theater of belief and fear, the historical record becomes less a chronicle of battles won and lost, and more an exhaustive study in psychological dominion.